Welcome to InkThinks, and welcome to part 2 of my Halloween week special. Last time I talked about Scorpion in Smash, and this time we're breaking down the chances of Freddy Fazbear in Smash. One of the biggest surprises to me on this channel has been just how popular the idea of me covering Freddy Fazbear from Five Nights at Freddy's and his chances in Smash is. At first I thought that people were memeing, but the more I looked into it, the more I realized that the series still has a very devoted and passionate fan base. A few other creators on YouTube have talked about the possibility of Freddy in Smash, but almost always as a meme, and almost always as a possible moveset analysis. However, today I'm going to take the idea as seriously as I can and go through and break down every single argument for and against Freddy Fazbear in Smash. Let's get into it. The year was 2014, and creator Scott Cawthon was about to create a horror game that would become one of the most successful indie games of all time. Scott cut his teeth designing media in the early 2000s when he was hired by Hope Animation, a Christian movie studio, where he helped them create movies to entertain kids and help bring them closer to Christ. In 2007, he released one of these Christian movies on his YouTube channel called The Pilgrim's Promise. Despite being kind of on the nose and corny, it was actually pretty impressive when you consider that Scott made the movie entirely on his own, besides some help voice acting from a family member. You can see this kind of work ethic continue into his game creations. As he transitioned more and more from movie development into video game development, he released a few different titles. These included Desolate Room, Desolate Hope, Sit and Survive, and Chipper & Sons Lumber Company. All of his games at this time were especially family friendly, and even had some Christian undertones. One of these games was especially harshly received though, Chipper & Sons Lumber Co. Critics said that the animals looked creepy and moved unnaturally. It reminded them of animatronics. So after receiving this feedback, Scott said, "Screw it, let's go with it," and dove headfirst into the creepy animatronic idea and released Five Nights at Freddy's, which became a huge hit and saw massive success, due in large part to streamers and YouTubers finding the game very accessible. It had just enough horror to entertain audiences, but not so much horror that the general audience was turned off. One of the things that made the success of Five Nights at Freddy's unique was how quickly Scott was able to turn around sequels. Within a year after the first game's release, Scott released 3 more games. It's absurd how quickly he was able to get these games out, and it really helped keep the momentum of Freddy's hype train going. Honestly, Scott's schedule must have been absolutely insane for him to keep up. Now, despite its success, Five Nights at Freddy's is an indie game, which a lot of people like to try and use against Freddy's chances in Smash. I think that it's important to break this down a bit. While it is true that we have yet to see a pure indie character become a fighter, there are a lot of things that blur the lines. Cuphead and Sans were both added as Mii costumes, and Shovel Knight was added as an assist trophy. Not to mention that Steve, who's arguably both an indie character and a AAA character, was able to make it into the game as a fully fledged fighter. I haven't really seen anything to suggest that indie characters can't be fully fledged fighters. If anything, the inclusion of those characters I just mentioned served to show that Nintendo doesn't actually care too much about indie status. Sure, they haven't added a purely indie character to the roster if you don't count Steve, but it's a fallacy to assume that just because they haven't done it, they'll never do it. It's something called hasty generalization. I don't see the indie argument being one that holds a ton of weight. While we don't have any strong evidence to suggest that Nintendo will never add an indie character, I don't want to entirely dismiss the argument, because I think that when people make it, they're probably not actually referring to the status of indie character, rather they're trying to make an argument targeted toward the scope and reach of the actual game and franchise. For example, when you take a look at games such as Hollow Knight and compare the sales to that of Dragon Quest, you get 2.8 million sales of Hollow Knight compared to Dragon Quest's sales of over 70 million copies. That said, some of the numbers of these games are really impressive. Banjo-Kazooie's franchise sold just over 3.5 million copies. Fire Emblem Three Houses sold around 3 million, ARMS sold just over 2 million, and the Persona series has sold just over 10 million copies, with Persona 5 specifically being around 4 million sales. Let's compare these to some of the most popularly talked about indie characters. Shovel Knight had around 2.5 million copies sold. Cuphead had an amazing 6 million. Undertale had nearly the same as Banjo-Kazooie at just under 3.5 million sales, not counting console sales, which I couldn't find a good number on, but it likely drastically increases the number. Five Nights at Freddy's doesn't have any official sales numbers, but using Steam Spy, we can see that the series comes in at around 6.8 million copies sold on Steam. This is an insane number for an indie game. game. But it also probably is a lowball estimate when you consider that this doesn't factor in console sales, sales on other platforms besides Steam, or anything besides the 8 games listed on Steam, such as a few spin-off games that aren't on the platform, or taking into account book sales or other mediums of the series. In the end, Five Nights at Freddy's holds its own against many of the main series in Smash, and also beats or matches every indie game represented in Smash, even the widely requested Shantae series, which itself has just over 3 million sales. FNAF is a force to be reckoned with in its own right, and we see it even appearing on the Nintendo Switch. While some people may argue that Nintendo might set an indie character limit, I see them taking character presence, merit, and relevance much more into consideration than the distinction between indie and AAA. Some people have worried that Freddy's status as an indie character may lead to some legal troubles in implementing him, but I have no idea what these would be. I don't really see that holding much weight, as we've seen them be able to work with other indie characters before. Other people might argue that FNAF doesn't have enough enemies or characters, which to me seems easily debunked by just looking at the roster of animatronics, and I've also heard the no moveset argument pop up, which I'm now from here on out going to refer to as the unkillable zombie argument from hell, because no matter how many times I shoot this down, Nintendo shoots this down, and other creators shoot this down, it seems to just keep coming up from the dead in the Smash community, unable to die. Sakurai has shown his prowess with discovering movesets for nearly any character out there. If he was able to give a moveset to Captain Falcon, who literally never appears outside of his car in his games, he's not going to have any trouble with Freddy. For more on that, just look at the dozens of fan videos coming up with a moveset for the character. The last weak argument that I hear against Freddy is that his games are too low effort, or cringy to allow in Smash. Well, for the low effort argument, there's no denying that the early games at least were simple in design, but there's also no denying the insane attention and care that Scott Cawthon put into the games, or the insane production schedule that he maintained to keep up fan happiness and hype with the game. As far as cringe, this seems to be an argument similar to that of meme characters. I did a whole video on the topic that I'm going to throw up in the right hand corner right now, but essentially it boils down to this. People tend to become turned off to series that find themselves in the limelight after long enough. You see it with Undertale, Minecraft, Five Nights at Freddy's, and more. When a game hits a certain level of oversaturation within a small amount of time, people become annoyed with it and then begin looking for reasons to claim it's bad or cringy, or really to kind of just put themselves on a pedestal above people who like the game. As Kirby once eloquently said, hating popular things does not make you an interesting person. For further thoughts on this topic, check out that video in the top right hand corner now. So what is working against Freddy here? Well, for starters, we ought to talk about the mature content that his games revolve around. While Bayonetta is very sexualized and Snake does have a lot of violence and weapons in his games, we haven't seen any horror games represented as characters in Smash. While I don't think that Nintendo would necessarily discriminate against a whole genre, and I could see them looking for a horror rep, I think we need to ask if they would discriminate on the basis of the story. On the surface, Five Nights at Freddy's is a survival horror game without a ton of depth to it, but as you peel back the layers of the story, you find one that revolves around someone killing children, which is pretty dark. Would Nintendo hold that against Freddy for his inclusion? It's hard to say. I'm inclined to say no, actually. There have been a lot of dark themes in some of the other games represented in Smash, especially Persona 5 for example. But FNAF is different in the sense that the story largely takes place in the background rather than being hand-served to you. I don't think that Nintendo would really hold this against FNAF, but that said, I do see it potentially being an issue when FNAF is competing with other horror reps for the spot in the DLC. When it comes to Resident Evil, which has sold 13 million copies and has some strong relations with Nintendo, or Silent Hill, which has sold around 9 million copies, or even Bloodborne, which has only sold around 2 million copies but comes from a stronger established company, Freddy is definitely competing with some heavy hitters that I'm not sure he can knock out of the running. So, in the end, do I think that Freddy stands a good chance? Well, first off, I was absolutely blown away by the sales, impact, and influence of the series. There's no denying that. That said, I do think that Freddy's biggest obstacle, like I said, is going to be separating himself from the competitive herd of the other picks for the roster, specifically horror reps. And while Freddy does have good sales, I really just don't think that he's going to be able to top out series like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. That being said, I could genuinely see Freddy having a really good shot at getting in as a meat costume. It would perfectly fit the fact that Freddy is an actual animatronic that has people inside of it in-game. That said, putting a tiny, cute Mii fighter inside of the suit might be a little bit on the nose. As far as getting a fully fledged fighter, I give Freddy's chances a 2.5 out of 10 due to needing to overcome the titans of the horror genre. That said, I give Freddy's chances of getting in as a Mii costume an 8.5 out of 10. I actually feel like he has a really good shot at that, especially when compared to some of the other indie reps who have been included as costumes. And there you have it, those are my thoughts on Freddy in Smash. Do you agree with me? Let me know in the comments or try to change my mind if you disagree. This was part 2 of my Halloween special. Click the video on the top right to see my thoughts on Scorpion in Smash, or the playlist on the lower right to watch my entire final analysis playlist. The video on the left is something that YouTube handpicked just for you, so check it out. Click subscribe if you want to see my next Halloween video coming up on Skull Kid and Doom Guy after that. Until next time, stay smashing.